Today I'm going to show you how to make portable soup. Portable soup was very popular in the 18th century for many good reasons. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So let's talk a little bit about what portable soup is. It's a very concentrated form of essence of meat, sort of like a solidified broth. And in the time period, they used it like we would use soup bouillon today. It goes by many different names in period texts. You'll see it as portable soup, portable broth, pocket soup, veal glue, I like this one, portmanteau pottage, and the list goes on and on. Portable soup was extremely convenient. It doesn't take up very much space. It's very light. It's a very condensed food source, and it's very flavorful in that very condensed form. It was used by military, by travelers, even used as an invalid food source at times, especially aboard ship. So it was used in many different situations. But it was very difficult to make, especially in a home setting. It took a long period of time to make. You have to watch it all the time, because if you turn your back on it and it got too hot, it would ruin all your work. So it was very laborious, and it was even industrialized in the 18th century. Even if you're not a historical reenactor yet, this portable soup makes an excellent homemade flavor booster that's all natural, and you can use it in sauces, soups, gravies, so it's great for that. Now, if you've watched our recent bone broth video, this recipe starts off exactly the same way. Now, you can do this over a slow open fire. You can do it on your stove top, or since you're probably doing this at home and you want to make this easy, I really suggest using a slow cooker. I'm using a medium-sized slow cooker that'll hold about 5 pounds of meat. If you want to make a larger batch, I suggest using a kitchen roaster. The meat I'm using is beef shank, similar to what we used in our bone broth video. Beef shank is a hard-working muscle, so it's a tough cut of meat. It has a lot of collagen in it, which makes it especially good for this recipe. Another good cut of beef would be the neck bone. Other cuts will work, but just not as well. Now, this can be done with poultry. You can boil that in water, and that will be the basis of this portable soup. So you can go ahead and place your meat in your slow cooker and cover it with water. Most of the recipes we've found suggested adding nothing else. Seasoning can come later when it's actually used as the portable soup. Some of the recipes suggest using only the meat. Other ones include the bones, and that's what we're doing in the recipe today. Turn your slow cooker on low and go about your business for the next 8 to 10 hours. Once the time has gone by, remove the meat. You can now pick it clean of the bones and any remaining gristle and fat. This is really good tasting beef. At this point, turn off your slow cooker and let it cool completely. As it cools, the fat on the top will solidify, making it very easy to remove. Once you're done with that, strain your broth and filter it through a piece of cloth to get out all the settlings. So go ahead and rinse out your slow cooker, return the clarified broth to it and turn it back on low. Let it go and leave the lid off. Let it cook for anywhere from 18 to 24 hours. What we're doing at this stage in the process is reducing the broth down to a gelatin. Gelatin is an interesting thing. Don't expect to be able to reduce this down into a hard block. What you end up with is a nice medium brown gluey substance. If you overcook it, you will burn it, giving it a very, very unpleasant taste. Once your soup reaches this stage, turn off your slow cooker and let it cool completely. Then you can turn the gel out onto a cloth. Now, this soup is still very gelatinous. To get it to the point where you can store it, put it in your pocket, it needs to be dried. Now, you cannot do this with heat. Any temperature of heat will just turn this into a liquid again, and then you'll just burn it. So it needs to be done without heat. You can do this in a dehydrator, but you need to make sure the dehydrator doesn't heat anything up. The period recipe actually suggests turning it out onto a woolen flannel cloth, just like we've done here, and flipping it over 2 or 3 times a day for 10 days or 2 weeks or so. If If you want to speed this process up at home, put this on a cooling rack and put it in front of a fan, and it'll dry out in a couple of days. The end results will be a very stiff paste. It's almost like leather. You're going to cut this up into chunks and then wrap it up in paper or something similar to store it away. It'll continue to harden as it ages, but it's completely usable in this leathery hard form. One quick note before we start this video, all the results are based upon 19th century tests. With modern materials, you may not be able to get the same kind of results. Today we're covering the top 6 historical egg preservation techniques. You will not believe how well number 1 works. We're so excited about this primitive and historic food preservation series, and I know many of you asked for this, so this series is going to be great. We just did salted beans, so check that episode out if you haven't already seen it. And also in the past, we've done salted pork, pemmican, and even the standing crust pie episode. Those all relate to historic food preservation, so make sure to go back and check out those old episodes. Today's episode came about because so many of you viewers out there asked specifically about egg preservation techniques. Chickens in the 18th century were a good bit different than the chickens we have today. In fact, the two most common breeds are endangered species or endangered breeds these days. So the result of modern chicken breeding techniques results in much larger eggs and eggs being laid throughout the year, unlike 18th century chickens. So as a result, if you have a recipe that uses a lot of eggs in it, you'll probably want to use medium eggs instead of the standard large or extra large eggs to better replicate and get those ratios right in the recipe. So before we get started with these preservation methods, we need to talk a little bit about the chicken egg itself, and specifically the shell. The shells on chicken eggs, or all eggs for that matter, are porous. And that means bacteria and mold spores can get into your egg and ruin it, and that moisture can evaporate out of your egg. And now neither one of these things we want to happen. So infection and evaporation are really the two big issues here. Now when an egg is laid, it naturally has a coating that protects from both of these things. Most store-bought eggs today have been washed with soap and water, and while these clean eggs sell better, it shortens the shelf life. On the other hand, farm-fresh eggs that have never been washed can last a relatively long time at room temperature, provided they aren't cracked, you keep them cool, and that they come out of a clean nest. So eggs that are cracked or dirty should be washed and used right away. Consider only the cleanest and freshest eggs for your long-term storage or preservation. There's some 20th century texts that talk about the biggest problem with spoilage in eggs really has to do whether the nest is dirty or damp. Egg preservation, it starts in the nest. So you've waited long enough. Here are the top 6 historic egg preservation methods from the least effective to the most effective. So number 6, burying your eggs in salt. Mrs. Fraser's cookbook references burying the eggs in salt. She actually says it's one of the best methods, but it doesn't work for very long. Well, the salt inhibits the bacteria. It does really good at that, but the salt also draws the moisture out of the eggs, and it makes them bad in a fairly short period of time from lack of moisture. Another version of this would be storing your eggs in brine, in a salt solution. And while that works too, it only works for a short period of time because it makes the eggs tremendously salty. The water lets the salt go into the egg. Number 5, storing your eggs in wheat bran. Wheat bran in the 18th century was a very common byproduct, very easy to come by, not so easy today. But the main idea behind the wheat bran was to keep your eggs dry. It does have a disadvantage in that wheat bran kind of has a musty smell or musty flavor, and it would impart that flavor into the eggs fairly rapidly. So that was one of the disadvantages. In the early 19th century, they did a number of experiments on egg preservation, and they tested this method, and they found that after 8 months, they had a failure rate of about 70%. So 70% of them went bad, but 30% of them were still goods, and 30% is better than nothing. Method number 4 is coating your egg. There are references to both shellac or varnish, varnishing your eggs. But the big problem with varnishing or shellacking an egg is, okay, you've painted it, now what do you do with it? If you set it down any place, it sticks to whatever you've stuck it to or whatever you've placed it. So it's very difficult to dry. So they would suggest that you wrapped the egg in paper and this let the coating dry without sticking to anything. And this method can also be supplemented with one of these other methods, like taking these eggs that are already coated and putting them in the bran or the salt. So that brings us to number 3, and that is also coating, but coating your eggs with an oil or oil-like substance. You can either coat them in butter, as many of the texts suggest, or a rendered animal fat. The problem with butter is that the butter goes bad. It goes rancid after a little bit of time. But the rendered suet, this stuff will last indefinitely at room temperature. So this is a great solution. If you're interested in rendered suet, make sure to check out our video that covers that. And I'll put a link down in the description that'll take you directly to this product. The early 19th century experiments using coatings like these, and generally, they had a 60% success rate. So only 40% went bad after 8 months. Number 2. It's pretty amazing. Wood ashes. You bury your eggs in wood ashes. It's so simple, and wood ashes are such a common thing to have, at least definitely in the time period. And really the best, really a stunning idea here is that with their experiments, they had a success rate of 80%. Only 20% of the eggs went bad after 8 months. It does have a little bit of a problem in that the eggs would take on a bit of an ashy taste, so there's a little bit of disadvantage there. A lot of the methods that we've covered so far have been mentioned in comments on YouTube and on Facebook, but this last method nobody has mentioned yet, and it's straight out of the 18th century. You'll find it in cookbooks and on patents, and it has astounding results. So the number 1 18th century egg preservation method is, what is this white stuff? It's slaked lime. What do you think the success rate is for eggs in lime water? At 8 months, you get an astounding 100% of the eggs that are still good. That is amazing. No refrigeration, no crazy stuff. All you need is slaked lime and a bucket of water. So let me show you how to use this to preserve your eggs. So just a word or two about lime before we get started. Lime was a very common product in the 18th century, used for building techniques and other things. Lime was made by burning oyster shells or limestone in these lime kilns, and that would create quicklime. And quicklime, once you added it into water, would create slaked lime, and then slaked lime, actually, when you paint that on a wall or make it into, say, mortar mix, the slaked lime absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and creates limestone again. And that's what's so great about lime. It's this great circle of useful things you can do with it. I buy my slaked lime at a building supply store or, say, a masonry supply store. Ask for hydrated lime. This is not the same thing as the lime you would find in the garden supply section of your store. That's actually just ground up limestone. So to get started, we're going to need a watertight vessel. I'm not doing very many eggs today, so I'm going to use this 2-quart jar. These are available on our website. If you're doing a lot more eggs, you'll want a bigger vessel, something like a keg or anything that really holds water in a much bigger way. So to start, we're going to put a little bit of this powdered lime into the bottom of our vessel here. I'm just using a couple of ounces. If you're using something bigger, using the appropriate amount. And now, before we've poured anything in, let's just fill our vessel up with eggs. So you'll want to make a solution. I'm using 1 quart of nice clean tap water along with 1 ounce of hydrated lime. If you're using a bigger thing, just use that same kind of ratio, 1 quart to 1 ounce. 1 ounce of this hydrated lime is about 3 tablespoons. And then let's just pour the solution right over the top of our eggs. So the recipes call for protecting this from evaporation, and most of the recipes suggested something like a layer of oil, maybe olive oil on top, and that will keep the water from evaporating. This jar happens to have a nice tight lid. The water's right up here to the surface, so I don't think I need a layer on this particular one. So all of these techniques continued to be used from the 18th century all through the 19th century and right into the 20th century until home refrigeration became very, very common. And there were only a few little additions. In the 19th century, you see the addition of, say, water glass being used that wasn't used earlier. But really, they were essentially the same. There are some 18th century references that refer to this technique and say the eggs will keep up to 2 years. That is incredible. This little experiment or this technique, methods, these are all, it's really neat. It would be great to use in your historical presentation if you're at a historic site or something like that. It would also be really, really good to connect with kids. If you've got kids looking for a project to do, a science project, this would be a great project to play around with. It's kind of long term, but it's a great project. It's a great way to connect with your kids to do a project like this and to see whether you can get the same kind of results that they did. Hi, I'm John Townsend from James Townsend & Son, and many people ask in the comments of our videos, they ask, John, have you ever made something you really didn't like? Well, today we're gonna find out. In a previous video, I talked about the broad categories of food preservation techniques used in the 18th century, including salting, pickling, curing, and other methods. Obviously, they didn't have the rich resources of foods that we have available to us today. And they planned their foods around the items that they had available at the time, things that were in season. And when they had extra, they had fairly primitive ways to preserve them. Now, like I said in previous episodes, we know a lot more today about foodborne pathogens and how dangerous improperly preserved foods can be. So make sure to use caution when using any of these kind of original recipes. Now that we have that out of the way, let me show you what we're going to make today. Pickled smelt. You're gonna love this, or maybe not. Now, smelt are a small sardine-like family of fish that live in either fresh or salt water. They migrate up beaches and inland streams at various times of the year to spawn. Now, I love smelt, but I always have them fried, and fried smelt were popular in the 18th century too. But what were you supposed to do if you had more smelt than you could eat? Well, you would preserve them, very much like we would preserve sardines today. The recipe we're using today for pickled smelt comes from Hannah Glass's 1784 cookbook, The Art of Cookery. However, you can find this recipe virtually verbatim in many other 18th century cookbooks. Now, the title of this recipe is a little misleading. It's called pickled smelt. And technically, pickles, when you preserve using pickling, it's preserved by an acidic environment, like, say, vinegar. But this recipe does not use vinegar at all. It actually uses saltpeter and salt. So technically it's a curing or a salt cure. This recipe calls for 1/4 of a peck of smelt. Now, if fresh smelt is not available in your area, you can check the seafood section at your grocery store and you will likely find frozen smelt. That's what we've got here. It's already dressed and ready to use. The recipe calls for black pepper, about 1/2 ounce, which turns out to be 2 tablespoons. Also 1/2 ounce of nutmeg, which is also 2 tablespoons, and 1/4 ounce of mace, which is, say, 3½ teaspoons. Next, we need a ½ ounce of saltpeter and 4 ounces of bay salt. Now, saltpeter can be difficult to find these days, but luckily we have available to us Morton's Tender Quick. You can usually find this in your canning section at a hardware store or at a grocery store, and that is a great equivalent. It has the same ratio of chemicals in here. It's going to work exactly the same way. For this kind of preservation technique, you really need a crock or a jar. And the jars that we have in our catalog, we've got a 1 quart and a 2 quart jar. These stoneware jars are made right here in Indiana, and they are perfect for this kind of job. I'll make sure to put a link down in the text of this video right to these jars. Now it's time to pack the smelt into our little crock here. And the first thing we're going to do is to put in a layer of our salt and spices. And we're going to get in maybe an 1/8 of an inch thick layer here in the bottom. And now let's pack some smelt in. You want them to lay it in just one fish thick. Now let's put in 3 bay leaves. And now we just repeat this over again. If you follow this recipe exactly, you'll probably need 2 of these 1 quart crocks, or possibly a 2 quart crock. So to finish this off, the recipe calls for topping this off with a heated or boiling port wine. If you don't have port wine, you can use a sweet red wine also. To finish this off, we just put our lid on, and then we'll cover this crock up with a coarse cloth and tie it off so that it doesn't get knocked over. Now, normally in the time period, you'd store this in a cool, dry place, and you would probably leave it for a couple of weeks before you bothered to open it, or as long as you needed to store it before you'd want to use it. Now, in a modern setting, I would suggest, for safety purposes, that you actually store yours in the refrigerator. And again, you can let these set for at least a couple of weeks before you want to dip in and see how they turned out. Now, this batch of smelt we did a couple of weeks ago, so these are ready to try out. And another thing, many times it's mentioned in these pickling recipes to make sure not to put your fingers in the pickle, and always use a utensil like a wooden spoon to dig those out, or else you will contaminate that pickle and it will go bad right away. And even they understood that in the 18th century. Well, they don't smell bad. They definitely have changed color and a little bit of texture. They've sort of broken down a little bit. So maybe they're good. I guess it's time to try one out. I mean, they've, okay, I'm going to try one out. Let's find out here. There's our fish. Well, they're salty. That's what comes up right away. They're definitely not fishy. They're very spicy. I can see why they would want to have something like this. It's definitely something like a garnish. Not a main dish, although, I mean, you could put some of these on, say, a bed of rice or something. Or use them as a spice in other dishes. You'll find that in many recipes from the 18th century. Definitely much better than I expected. I wouldn't eat them all day, but they're actually pretty good. Have you ever found yourself on a hot summer day, you've worked hard or you've played really hard and you're wrung out? You really need something to drink. Well, today we're going to be making a 1,000-year-old energy drink that was popular in the 18th century. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So, you know, we really don't do drinks very frequently here on the show, but we do plan on doing a series on drinks here in the future. Today, the drink we will be making is called Switchel. According to the Oxford Companion for American Food and Drink, Switchel is a New England invention. But others say that switchel actually came from the Caribbean to North America. Well, probably more likely it turns out that switchel is just related to a number of very similar drinks that have been used or made for 1,000 years in various cultures around the globe. Switchel also goes by the name of sitchel, aquaforte, ginger punch, Yankee beverage, and swizzle. This drink is high in potassium. That's an electrolyte the body needs, especially when you've perspired a lot. And this drink was used for exhausted field hands and sailors alike. Most recipes for switchel are found in mid-19th century cookbooks, but it's firmly rooted in 18th century references also. You can even find very similar drinks used by Roman soldiers to refresh themselves, and the ancient Greeks had a very similar drink that was called oxymel. This invigorating tonic can be made in several different ways, and it's very easy to put together. The recipe we're using today is from a mid-19th century cookbook called The Skillful Housewife. I'll start with a half a gallon of clean drinking water. To this I'll add a half a cup of unsulfured molasses, a quarter cup of apple cider vinegar, and a heaping tablespoonful of powdered ginger. Now stir this really well. Be sure to use a Barbados molasses or a light molasses, and definitely not a blackstrap molasses. That'll be much too bitter. Some of the recipes actually call for the use of maple sugar or maple syrup instead, and some of those references to molasses actually mean maple syrup. Honey makes another great alternative. That Roman drink, that was be made with honey instead of with molasses. Instead of or in addition to the vinegar, you can use lemon juice or lime juice, and that'll make a very interesting variation. Instead of the powdered ginger, you could use a fresh ginger that's finely minced. But powdered ginger was a much more common way to find ginger in the 18th century. Ginger was one of the most common and one of the most inexpensive spices available at the time. Another great variation to this would be to add your daily rum ration right to this drink. That would make a great version of this. A closely related drink is a popular concoction called shrub. It was various fruit juices, something like that of raspberries or blackberries, sweetened how you pleased and added to vinegar. We offer a book at James Townsend & Son called Libations of the 18th Century. This does have recipes for switchel as well as many other popular drinks of the time. So many times this drink was placed in a jug and suspended down into a well or placed in a running stream of water to cool it off. But we've all found that when we drink cool things on a hot day, it can upset our stomachs. That's one of the reasons why we believe that they had added ginger to this drink. Well, let's give this a try. It looks good. You know, it still has the smell of vinegar, but not very strongly. You know, vinegar is about the last thing I ever want to eat or drink. But this, actually, it reminds me a lot of a good apple cider. It's very good. I can see why this would be a very, very popular drink, especially in hot weather. So today I've got with me Dave Taylor, and he is a coffee expert. And we're going to cover 18th century coffees in general, and specifically roasting green coffee beans over a fire here in an 18th century manner. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Dave Taylor is a longtime friend, and tell us a little bit about your history with coffee and reenacting.
I started reenacting in '75, and it's been a long, eventful, colorful, interesting journey.
That's like 40 years, Dave. Do you know?
Yeah.
40 years. Anyway.
That's right. When John was a child,
Yes,
that's when I got started in this hobby. But it's been a long and interesting journey, and I've learned lots of things over the years, and I recommend the hobby to anybody because you get to do and see things that most people don't get to do.
What about your coffee experience?
Coffee experience, I started roughly 15 years ago in the coffee business, opening up coffee houses. My first introduction, I lived in San Francisco in the late 60s and early 70s, and there was a coffee roaster about 2 blocks from my apartment, and I would go down there and I'm going like, this is not
So cool.
Folgers.
Yeah.
A whole different world in coffee. And then moving back to Indiana, that kind of folded because there was no coffee roasters here. And about 15 years ago, we opened up coffee houses. We had the Blue Lion coffee houses, and we started probably about a year or so later, started roasting our own coffees. A lot of people who never drank coffee before started drinking coffee once they were able
Once they tasted your coffee.
yeah, once they started tasting my coffee, and that's, that's almost like a commercial, but at the same time, it's absolutely true, because they'd never had really good coffee, and they're going like, I didn't know coffee could taste like this.
What's typical, at least for the time period? What are the different variations?
When coffee is green, that's how you typically want to purchase it. And that was typically in the 18th century. That's how you bought coffee. Right. Well, because you shipped long distances.
Right.
You come from the Caribbean.
So almost everybody that's making coffee at home, they're going to be roasting it themselves.
Correct. They're
Okay.
going to roast it themselves.
So what kind of equipment do we need?
Okay. Well, a basic skillet. In coffee, when they first started roasting, they used a skillet, or like that, and that's still typical in a lot of Arabic countries. You roast the coffee right then. You go ahead and you grind it, and that process. It's almost like the Japanese tea ceremony.
Right.
You do the whole thing right there.
Right. And that's the new frying pan that we have on our website, and I'll make sure to put a link down in the description text.
And this is a typical 18th century. You notice the legs on here, the spew on here. This tells you it's 18th century in how this was made, when it was made. And then a lot of people think this is a sauce pot, but it is not a sauce pot. This is actually a coffee roaster.
Cool.
The reason is you have the rounded bottom. You want to keep your coffee moving all the time.
Right.
This is an 18th century coffee roaster also. You would put the beans in here. This set, either you could set it on the edge, but a lot of times just set on the fireplace dogs.
Right.
Set like this, and you're turning this like this, and that's
Right.
and this is still contemporary roasters today. Use that same method. The roaster that I roast coffee commercially, drum roaster, just like this.
Cool.
This style of roaster here, I
Kind of
don't
like the
know.
whole thing enclosed. Yeah.
Right. This is where you would drop your charcoal down inside,
So it's like a built-in brazier.
right. This is like a brazier. To roast good coffee, you pay attention. And to what you're doing, and you never let it sit there. If you let it sit there, you have black on the bottom
And green on the top.
top.
That's bad. Okay.
Different coffee beans will have different characteristics, and that's how whether it's like a Mexican coffees will be very sweet, as opposed to African coffees that are like dry red wines.
Right. So it depends on the soil
right.
and the climate and all that good stuff.
Which side of the mountain it grew on.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
they're just like wines. There's 1,200 different chemical compositions in coffee, and all of those things bear upon how the flavor of the coffee is going to be. So, and then you have different coffees, like I said, that have characteristics that can be more forgiving.
Okay. Yeah.
So
easy ones and hard ones.
Right.
Yeah, right.
In saying that, we'll kind of get this batch started.
Okay. So what kind of beans? What beans do you have in this lot here?
These are South and Central American beans. And like I said, this is and there are some Mexican beans in here, give it an inherent sweetness. And then there's the South American bean that is, there again, very forgiving, that's used in almost all basic coffees, including espressos. So it gives you a lot of latitude in what you can do. So you could roast this very light roast.
So let's get some beans in the pot, I guess.
And these are some green beans. This is a mixture I've set up that I typically take to events. Now the key to roasting is you have to keep the beans moving all the time. You can't.
And you had this pan preheated. We had this setting on the fire, nice and hot. How hot do you really want to get that?
Well, you want to end up. You're going to take the internal temperature, or the temperature of these beans on the outside, 350 to 450 degrees. So they do get hot. So you're almost to the point where you would melt solder. And see, that's one of the things here is you can see the advantage of the rounded pan. Coffee typically after it's roasted is good for about 6 weeks. That's the time that you want to drink it in. And you can see it's starting to change in color. You have what is first and second crack or pop, and it's kind of like popcorn, and it will start to take off some of the outer husk here. Okay. Now you see that chaff coming up?
Yeah.
That is, we're getting into the first crack of this, and that's where the beans are starting to expand a little bit, and they're taking off that outer layer.
Right.
And this is where you got to pay attention. The reality is that 30 seconds to a minute can make a big difference in how your beans will come out. And you can see now we're getting a big difference in the color now.
What are you looking for in a smell as you're getting toward the end? And do you usually look mostly at the color, or do you really go by a smell?
You're using all that. You're trying to have these come out at a certain time temperature ratio within 10 to 20 minutes. If you're less than 10 minutes in your roasting process, a lot of times the outside will be like a cake that is cooked on the outside but still raw on the inside.
Right. So you got to take your time.
Yeah. But if you go too long, you're going to bake the beans instead of roast them.
Okay.
And in other words, it would be like dried out bread as opposed to toast.
Okay.
You can see now.
Right.
And there's
really
some shine
browning
on there.
Right. The shine, you can see like the oil has come out to the outside.
And so this is about where I would typically want to stop roasting for myself.
Okay.
For my flavor. So you can see this is a combination of lights and darks, and this is because I set it on here sometimes and not keep it moving.
So you get a bit of a mix there.
Right. And this is probably, for this batch, this is where I would stop.
Okay.
And at that point, you pour it in here.
Okay. Yep.
And what you want to do is cool these down. Beans,
So just keep cooking if you...
if you leave them hot, they'll keep cooking.
So we've got this wonderful roast here, and really the idea is to get you to be able to make a better cup of coffee, especially in the camp, and the most proper and authentic way. So we've taken our green beans and we've roasted them, and now we've got the next step of turning this into our coffee drinks. What have we got here for the grinding?
Yeah. Well, this is a typical 18th century grinder. This is what you would find if you look in say Artifacts of the American Revolution. There's a couple of examples in this grinder in there.
Right. We actually sell this particular style on our website and in the catalog. Sometimes they're sold today as a giant pepper grinder, but really they're a Turkish
coffee grinder, and this has been typically, I can't even really tell you how far back they go.
Right.
Far farther than the American Revolution, though.
Right. These guys typically are made for a Turkish grind, so they grind very fine.
Correct.
You can open this up to the maximum, and it's still a pretty fine grind.
Yeah, it's still going to be fairly fine.
We're ready to toss it in our water. This is simmering, boiling?
Yeah, it's just on the edge of boil. And typically what you really are looking for, perfect water temperature, 195 to 205 degrees. So even if you get your water boiling, what you do is you pull the pot off and let it settle it just a little bit.
Yeah.
And we're going to dump that in there. Here, let me give this a little bit of a stir. It's sitting on top. And you can see that kind of bubbled up there a little bit.
Yeah.
Nice brown. So let's take this off here. We're going to set this just right here on the side. And we'll let this set here for a minute or so and just kind of brew up.
We've got a little cold water here to settle the grounds.
Hopefully they get them to sink down.
And it looks like we got a little bit here, but not bad. And you can see it's a little cloudy, so we have a little bit here. You could also, put a little piece of cloth or something across the top maybe to filter it out.
So Dave, I'm not a coffee drinker, so this is going to be, what do you think?
It's hot. It's still hot.
It smells good. It smells wonderful.
Yeah, it came out to be a pretty good roast. Not too dark. You have that good coffee flavor in there. A medium body. So I'm real pleased with how this came out.
Right.
Very drinkable. In 2 or 3 days, actually about the 3rd day after coffee is roasted, that's when it's at its very best.
So
this
super fresh roasted isn't the best.
Right.
You want fresh ground.
Fresh ground. That's what you want. So what you typically want to do is drink your coffee in a 6-week period after it's roasted. So people ask about, do I want to freeze this coffee, put it in the refrigerator? No, you don't. Because every time you take that coffee out of the refrigerator and you bring it out, it attracts moisture out of the air and you're ruining your coffee. When you grind coffee, that 6-week window of flavor drops down to 12 hours.
Whoa!
So you're going to lose 6 weeks of flavor. All that work that you went to roast that coffee and to make the perfect cup.
Buying pre-ground coffee is just crazy.
No, you don't want, because how long has it been sitting in a warehouse?
We're using the greens that we collected in our last video to make a wonderful springtime soup. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. It's such beautiful springtime weather out right now that I just had to get out of the kitchen, out of the house. You know, it's been a long winter, so we're going to be doing this soup with our springtime greens right out here in a camp setting. Let's get started with our soup. I'm going to put probably a quart of water here, maybe a little less. And let's get that started warming up. If you're going to be making your soup with a beef base or some kind of a meat base, especially say you're going to be using a salt ration, then you'll want to put your salt ration in here ahead of time when it's cold. If you're using a fresh beef ration, you want this water boiling when you put it in. For our portable soup that we're going to be using today, actually that goes in last, so we're not going to put the portable soup in yet. For this particular soup, the first thing that goes in is our barley. And let's put in just about a handful of barley here. And regular barley will take approximately an hour in your boiling water before you're ready to put in your other ingredients. You could also put in rice, steel cut groats, or something similar too. Springtime is the perfect time to get out and reconnect with nature and reconnect with your friends and your family in a cooking experience like this, or a spring camping time. It is a perfect time of year for that kind of thing. I really love this time of year because it's so much different than, say, summertime. You get a lot of the plants aren't up yet, but there are no mosquitoes, there's no ticks. We got migratory birds this time of year, so it's a totally different kind of experience. I've got stinging nettles, which is the bulk of what's going on here. And I'm going to chop them up fairly small. The stinging part of these stinging nettles, which is formic acid, goes away in the high temperature of the boiling. So we don't need to concern ourselves, worried about whether that's going to hurt us when we eat it. I've got a little bit of wild garlic. Yeah, I called this wild onions in the last video, but actually with this tubular stem, it's wild garlic. Wild garlic is strong enough that you probably don't want a lot of it in here. I'm just going to use some of the green stems. Chop them up fine. I even have a few of the bulbs that I cleaned off, and we'll just chop those up and put those into. Don't need very much of that. It's gonna bring a lot of flavor in with it. Along with our dandelion greens I've got here, I also have some of the garlic mustard. I'm not going to use a lot of that. You really should pre-taste some of these greens so that you know whether it's going to be something you really want to put a lot of or a little into your soup. If you've got it, carrots, parsnips, many things could go in at this point. So our greens and our barley are done. It's time to put in the portable soup. Here are our little portable soup pieces. And, we're using about a quart of water, maybe a little bit less. We're going to need maybe 3 or 4 pieces this kind of size. And toss it in there. Now, the thing about the portable soup in this recipe is that we don't want to cook this a lot after we put in the portable soup. As soon as the portable soup has dissolved, it's no longer in its little blocks, then your soup is done and it's time to take it off the fire. So I'm going to pay attention to this to make sure that I catch this as soon as it's basically dissolved. It only takes a few minutes, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 minutes for this stuff to break down. I know you're going to ask about a vegetarian version of this same soup. The perfect answer is mushroom ketchup powder. When you get done making your batch of mushroom ketchup, your leftover mushrooms, you let those dry out, and this is a spectacular flavor booster. It's got some salt in it. It's got wonderful flavors, and it's perfect for this. In fact, I think I'm going to cheat and put some in while no one's looking. It definitely is going to need some seasoning, so I've got our pocket spice kit. It's great for a little camping trip like this. Let's go ahead and put in some salt and definitely some pepper. And of course I like pepper, so more the better. And maybe just to give it a little extra zing, how about some cayenne? Also, if you want to thicken this up and you're on the trail, a little bit of ship's biscuit in here would be a great addition. Oh yeah, that's great. And the greens too. This is done. Our soup has cooled down and it looks great. It's really it's even thickened up a little bit. It's still rather warm, but the greens are in there. You can see the barley in there. It's got a nice color to it. Wow, that is excellent soup. There's nothing like cooking your meal out over an open fire like this with greens that you've just gathered, and it's wonderful flavor. Wow, nice tooth to it. The barley thickens it up nicely. A great flavor from the portable soup. Oh, and that portable soup, we're going to show you in our next episode, next Monday, just how you can make very easily, very simply, this portable soup at home.
Today we're going to be making historic donuts. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. I'm joined today by Michael Dragoo. You've seen him in some of the past episodes where we did Scott's eggs and some other things. Where does this recipe come from, Michael?
First reference in this country to donuts is from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery, 1805 edition.
Right, in the 1805 edition, that's the one with all the addition of the American recipes. That's the first one where they add in donuts, corn, cranberries, I think. Lots of interesting variations of the English recipes into sort of an American form. Is 1805 the first time that donuts were called donuts that we know of?
1803, 1805, there's a couple of cookbooks that are referring to dough nuts, 2 words.
2 words?
Yep, it's a coming from Europe, it's a Dutch kind of a thing, but the first time it's called donuts is in these cookbooks.
There are earlier recipes that talk about nuts, ginger nuts, pepper nuts. Those were baked little kind of cookie things.
A hard exterior, with a soft,
Right, but I think because of the shape and what's going on here, that's where the name probably comes from.
Yep.
But these were made with sort of like a bread dough, so they're called donuts instead, and cooked in hot oil, deep fat fried.
Yep.
So these seem to be related to the oliekoeken, which is a Dutch dish. They also are very similar to English fritters. So let's get started on this recipe. Michael, what have we got for ingredients?
It's a pretty loose recipe. We've got 3.5 to 4 cups of flour.
Right.
We've got half a cup of sugar.
Okay.
And we've got a teaspoon of salt.
Good.
And we've got, it called for 2 spoonfuls of yeast. And at the time...
They would have used barm. Today we're using instant yeast in this because we can add that directly here. If you want to research that barm, we've got a video where we deal with barm specifically. We'll put a link right here in the video so that you can look at that.
You don't want to overwork this, but it's just real light. And then we've got a cup to a cup and a half of warmed milk. We've got a half a cup of butter. It's not very hot. Just we don't want to kill the yeast, right? We're just going to mix that all up. And this should make a nice soft dough.
Let me clear off this table and we'll get some flour down so we can roll this out just very lightly. There you go.
I think we're all set here.
So we're not smushing this flat. We want to roll it out to about a 1/2 inch thick. Michael's going to cut these up into squares. The holes in donuts don't come till later on in the 19th century, something like the 1830s when holes show up in donuts. So we're just going to do a simple sort of square shapes.
These need to be small enough that they'll cook all the way through. And let them rise for a little bit.
Couple hours, maybe even if you're at home, you can let these rise overnight in the refrigerator. They should be either covered with plastic or cloth as they rise. So here are a few that we did last night. Your donuts may not rise a whole bunch because there's so much fat in this dough that they don't rise a bunch. But as we put them in the hot oil, they will spring right up, puff right up. So these look great. Your hot oil should be about 350 degrees. We're using lard here. Again, you can use any sort of deep frying oil that you'd like. You should fry these until they're a nice deep mahogany brown. While they're still hot, you can roll these in cinnamon sugar to finish them off. We've invited Ivy in to give these a try with a sample of these wonderful donuts. Go ahead and pick whatever your favorite one is there. I want a big one. Let's try this one. These are still warm right out of the oil.
Ooh. Oh, man. Such a simple recipe.
Yeah, the dough is so wonderful and soft when we cook them, and the flavor is great. The cinnamon sugar really sets these off, and they're right out of Hannah Glass's 1805 cookbook. Wonderful, wonderful. There's nothing better than Campfire donuts. Hi, I'm John Townsend, and today I'm going to be showing you how to preserve strawberries. It's a lost technique right out of the 18th century, and I think you're going to be very surprised. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Now, typically when we think of strawberry preserves today, we're thinking of jellies and jams where they're heated up and sort of pasteurized. But this is a no-cook method of preserving your strawberries. Today's recipe comes from Amelia Simmons' 1796 cookbook, American Cookery. It's a very simple recipe. Let's get started. The first thing we'll need is a storage vessel, and today I'm using one of our lidded stoneware jars from our website made by master potter Gary Nieder. As far as the ingredients go, it's very simple. We just have fresh strawberries cut up, we've got white sugar, and our secret ingredient, raisins. That's right, the secret ingredient is raisins. Have you ever considered how incredible raisins really are? Modern science tells us that raisins are full of antioxidants, flavonoids, phenol compounds, and lots of other crazy chemical sounding stuff. And these compounds inhibit the growth of bacteria, such as Listeria, Salmonella, and E. coli. And some modern breads use raisin juice and raisin paste to inhibit mold growth and increase shelf life. So it's very interesting that you find this recipe from the 18th century. Yes, they knew that adding raisins to their recipes would help it last longer without spoiling. So Simmons' recipe recommends a proportion between our 3 ingredients: 3 parts by weight of strawberries, 4 parts sugar, and 1 part raisins. The strawberries should be free of blemishes, their tops removed, the larger ones cut in half, and our raisins should be coarsely chopped. Raisins in the 18th century for the most part contained seeds, and these seeds would be removed before use. Chopping the raisins will release their preserving properties. Okay, as we begin, we want a layer of sugar in the bottom of our storage jar, about 1/4 inch at the bottom. Next, we'll put in a layer of strawberries, followed by a sprinkling of raisins. Then we'll repeat this again with a sprinkling of sugar, then our strawberries, then our raisins, and we'll repeat until we get to the top of the jar. Finish off with a layer of sugar, then put the lid on your jar and store it in a nice cool place. Over the next several days, the granulated sugar will turn into a thick syrup. And Amelia Simmons in her recipe suggests that if the weather is hot, you continue to add a little sugar to the jars. I recommend that you keep your strawberries in the refrigerator. Now here are some strawberries that we preserved a couple of months ago. These were stored in the refrigerator, and as you can see, they still look nice and red. Let's see how they taste. Well, they got a great, wonderful strawberry flavor. They're a little bit tougher because they've dehydrated. Most of the liquid you see in that jar is actually, well, all of it has been extracted out of the strawberries. But the flavor is wonderful. It's like a fresh strawberry flavor. Now we really have to put ourselves in their shoes. They just would not have had fresh strawberries out of season. So in the wintertime, if you wanted a strawberry flavor, this would be a great way to do it. And the question is what they would have done with these. They might have eaten them just like this, sort of like a fresh strawberry where you'd pull them out and you just eat them. More than likely, though, I imagine they would turn them into something like a tart, where you could put the raisins and the strawberries right in there together and bake them and have a wonderful strawberry flavor right in the wintertime. This is such an interesting method of preservation. If you get a chance, try it out. These would be great to take to an event to show off, or great at a historic site, because it's something you do not find typically done today. Hi, I'm John Townsend, and today we're doing another episode in our 18th century food preservation series. Today we're doing pickled onions. It is a traditional British food that was very popular in the 18th century. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Now, before we get started, I do have this one caveat. Pickling and canning techniques have really developed a lot since the 18th century. This is an 18th century technique, and if you use it, I recommend storing your pickled onions in the refrigerator. There are many 18th century recipes for pickled onions. This particular one is from Sarah Harrison's 1739 cookbook, The Housekeeper's Pocketbook. Onions were a very important vegetable in the 18th century. If the plantings were staggered properly, a family could have onions virtually year-round. We're using pearl onions, and pearl onions would have been picked early and laid out to dry or to cure for a couple of weeks. One recipe suggests that Spanish onions would be great for this recipe. We're going to pickle enough onions to fit in our small lidded stoneware jar. If you're pickling a larger quantity, you may want to use one of our 1 quart or 2 quart stoneware crocks. Now you can peel these if you wish by hand, but I'm going to show you an easier method that's discussed in some other 18th century recipes. Put your onions in a pan of cold water and set them over the fire. And as soon as they come to a boil, remove them from the fire, strain them, and allow them to cool completely. If you cut the root section off of your onions after they've cooled, then you can squeeze them right out of the outer layers. Now that our onions are ready, it's time to put together our pickle. Now, there were two schools of thought on vinegar in the 18th century for this kind of recipe. They would either call for distilled vinegar or they would call for white wine vinegar. Now, don't be confused about the term white wine vinegar in this recipe. The 18th century cookbooks were actually very explicit about this topic. White wine vinegar in the 18th century was not made with wine, like some things that you will find today, but it was made with malt. So we're using malt vinegar today. If you can't find malt vinegar, then you can use distilled vinegar. It just won't have as much flavor. I put my vinegar in a non-reactive saucepan. Today I'm using one of our pipkins. There are a number of seasonings that you can use in your pickle. Most of the recipes called for using salt. Harrison's recipe does not actually call for salt, but we're going to use some. Make sure to use kosher salt or pickling salt, definitely not iodized salt. In addition to about an ounce of salt, you want a half a teaspoon of peppercorns, 3 or 4 whole cloves, about a tablespoon of thinly sliced fresh ginger. Adding some bay leaves or broken up nutmeg might be an interesting addition too. We're going to set this over the fire until it comes to a boil, and then we're going to let it cool completely. These will take about 10 days to pickle. And again, make sure to store them in your refrigerator. So here are some that have been prepared in advance, and let's give them a try. That was delicious. These would be great for a garnish or even all by themselves. These are wonderful. There were many different kinds of pickled vegetables in the 18th century so that they would be able to, preserve things the whole year round. But I can understand why these are still popular today. In our episode today, we're making a very tasty lemon cream. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So I'm here with Michael Dragoo today, and we're going to be doing this recipe. What's this recipe from?
This is from the 1796 Amelia Simmons American Cookery.
Right. It's one of the cookbooks we offer that's in a facsimile sort of format, so you can take it to an event. It's just like the cookbook would have been in the day. What are our ingredients we need for this?
We've got 6 egg whites and 1 whole egg,
Okay.
including the yolk. And we've got the juice of 4 lemons. And we've got a cup of water and 2 cups of sugar. And then we are going to strain that concoction before we put it over the fire.
This will get all the treadles out of the eggs, so it's a nice smooth mixture.
And one final thing, I'm going to add the rind, 1 whole lemon.
That's all we need to do. Let's put this over a medium to low heat. While this is on the fire, you need to constantly stir this so it doesn't burn. Gently heat this until just before boiling, and it will start to change texture, and that's when you need to take it off. While this is cooking, you'll want to scum off the top occasionally to get rid of the foam that develops at the top.
Here we go.
It thickened right up. Just before boiling or right at boiling, it really changes consistency and gets nice and thick. The recipe says to serve it in china bowls. So these are just perfect for this. These little bowls are new to the catalog this year.
You can serve this up either hot or let it cool down and have it cool. It's good either way.
We need our little tester. Come on in, Ivy. I've got a couple that are cooled that we made earlier so that we can try these out. You go ahead and try one of those. I'm going to try a warm one. Whoa. Ooh. Those are really, really good. It's like a perfect lemonade.
Lemon drop.
But,
Those are
right,
hot
but in
lemon drops.
But in a thick version for the table. And this would be, boy, this kind of filling in a tart would be extraordinary. This is like a lemon cream pie. Very, very wonderful. Either cool or warm.
You know what would be good if we tried to put this in some of those donuts?
Well, bring in a donut.
Oh.
Here. These are donuts we made last episode. Here we go. So let's try this out.
Yep.
Lemon cream plus the donut. Maybe we need a little whipped cream on top. Some of that glaze, that sugar glaze.
This is great too.
It doesn't get any better.
No. Oh man, this is the gift that keeps on
Could
giving.
start a donut shop. If you get a chance to make this lemon cream, I guarantee you'll love it. In today's episode, I'll be making bone broth, and I'll be explaining its versatility in 18th century foods. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Bone broth has really had a modern resurgence, especially in the last couple decades, and very recently it's gotten very popular. But bone broth has a very rich and deep history from the Middle Ages, and especially very versatile and used in so many dishes in the 18th century. So first, let's talk about what we're covering here, bone broth, especially its modern interpretation. Bone broth is a meat and bone combination, usually a sort of a difficult to use cut or a leftover, like a chicken carcass or something like that. It's cooked for a very long period of time at a fairly low temperature, something just right around boiling or a little bit lower. And usually spiced and has some other things like onion in it, and used for soups and broths, and it's very valued for its nutrition that it carries along with it, as well as its frugality. So there's so many different recipes I could pull out of 18th century cookbooks to give you an example of bone broth. The one we're using today is from Elizabeth Cleland's New and Easy Method of Cookery from 1755. This recipe she calls a rich broth. We're going to start off with 3 pounds of a beef houk, and that is a Scottish term for a cut of meat that today we call a shank. In some 18th century cookbooks, it might be called also a shin, a beef shin. And they might even refer to it as a skink. Some of these terms are very kind of confusing. Similar recipes also call for other difficult to use cuts of meat, like the scrag end. If you see a scrag end, that means the neck. And you'll see like beef neck used in this, sometimes mutton neck. But all these are the same thing. Very difficult to use cuts of meat. The shank here has got lots of connective tissue. It's a hard-working muscle, so it's very, very tough and difficult to cook in any other way. So many times I used it in a broth. This one's so simple. We've got our 3 pounds of meat with the bone in. We also have good clean water, and we've got salt in this recipe, and we've got some spices, and they vary depending on the recipe. This one's got pepper, it's got allspice in it, and some mace. Most of the 18th century cooking methods really fall into 2 camps. Either you can take your pot and put this in it and cook it over a low fire for 4 to 6 or sometimes as much as 12 hours, tending the fire all the time, keeping it on a low simmer. Or at times they put this in a cooking pot and slid it into the oven and had it bake for a long period of time, probably even overnight, so that this would cook down. Now we could certainly do this on the stovetop, but we're going to do this the easy way today. We're going to use a slow cooker. Most of the 18th century recipes really didn't talk too much about how long to cook this, at least in time-wise. They really referenced what's happening to the meat that's in the dish. They say things like cook it until it turns to rags, or until all the goodness is out of the meat. So let's get started with getting this cooking. Normally we just put our meat down in the bottom of our dish. Now let's add our spices. We've got our salt first and our other spices. We're going to pretty much fill this up, and we're going to put this on low. We're going to let this cook a good long time. You can, cooking overnight is great, or you can set this to start cooking before you go to work, and it'll probably be done when you get back. You can let this cook even longer if you really want to. 12 hours, 24 hours even, to really extract everything out of the meat and the bones. This smells great. The meat is nice and tender. This does a great job, releases all those great nutrients. This is wonderful. The recipe calls for removing the meat, remove the bones, and strain this off so that you take out all the shreds of meat. So there's so much we can do with these items now that we've got them to this state. The meat that's left over here, this is perfect for potting. This potted meat is very common in the 18th century. They'd take the meat that was very cooked like this. They'd chop it up, mince it up. They would grind it in a mortar and pestle even, so that they would make it very, very fine. Then mix it with clarified butter. And then they would actually put it in a pot, like our canister here, and then cover it over with clarified butter. And that clarified butter would stay liquid, and you could store that for a great period of time. When you wanted to eat some of that, you could just dip it out with a spoon and use it as a spread or something else. And the clarified butter would seal right back over the top of that, and you would be able to take out servings as you go. The broth here is the basis for so many dishes. Most of the soups are going to use a broth like this. You'd also use this broth as a basis for a ragu. So it's used in so many of the dishes. When this is completely cool, it'll be very easy to remove all the fat off the top of this broth. If you strain this broth through a cloth and then gently simmer that and reduce it and continue to reduce it, you'll end up with a very thick gelatin, which is the precursor to a portable soup, which we'll probably cover in a future episode. Today I will be preparing a forced or a farced cabbage. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Today's recipe comes from the 1747 second edition of Primitive Cookery. Now, the Primitive Cookery that we sell in our catalog is the first edition. Unfortunately, this recipe is not in the one we carry, but this recipe in the cookbook is called a cabbage pudding. But many times, making the dish in the manner that we're going to make it in is also referred to as a forced or sometimes a farced cabbage. So let's get started. So let's start out with our cabbage here. We need to use about half the cabbage, but we also need to save some really big outer leaves to use when we're putting this together. So I'm going to cut this at the bottom to release some of these outer leaves, and they don't have to be perfect, but try to pick nice good ones that don't have any nastiness from the outside. You might want to take the very outer ones off if they're dirty. So you want enough leaves to make a full sort of cabbage head when we're done. So I need at least 2 good half leaves. We're going to save those back, and now we're just going to cut this cabbage in half and then chop it up nice and finely. I've got our lightly boiled cabbage here, or just scalded. I'm going to add it to the pot here. This recipe calls for 1 pound of chopped up veal. Today I'm using just a ground beef, a very lean ground beef. The recipe calls for an equal amount of shredded suet. I'm actually going to lower the quantity of suet in this recipe and use just a half a pound of shredded suet. We are now offering a beef suet on our website and in the future in our print catalog. It's USDA, made in the United States, grass-fed beef suet, so it's really, really good stuff. Now let's spice this. The recipe calls for mace, nutmeg, salt, and pepper. And Finally, it also in the spice section talks about green gooseberries, green grapes, or barberries in season. None of those are in season. It says if you're making this in the winter, you can also add some verjuice, or in this case, since verjuice is a little hard to come by these days, you can get it online, but today I'm going to add a little bit of just plain apple cider vinegar, maybe 2 tablespoonfuls. And our final ingredient here, 3 egg yolks. You'll want to let your boiled cabbage cool down a little bit so it doesn't melt the shredded suet in your mixture. So this looks like enough to make 2 small boiled cabbage farces or 1 rather large one. I'm going to do a medium to smaller size one here, so it'll probably make enough for 2. And we're going to fill this leaf up with our mixture. The size is going to make a difference in the boiling time. There's our mount here. We're going to take a cabbage leaf and cover the top of it. If you've got some holes, you can use a second leaf here to finish up the looks of it. Now we need to put this in a pudding cloth. And that's one of the new products we've got here at James Townsend & Son. We took our natural linen fabric. We took about a 26-inch square or so, and we've got it hemmed up on all the sides, and it makes a perfect pudding cloth or a towel in the kitchen or at your campsite. This pudding or this boiled cabbage is not going to grow, so you can tie it fairly tightly. Like all boiled puddings, you want this to go into the water that's already boiling, and this is going to boil probably one this size about an hour, maybe an hour and a quarter. So let's get this into boil. Wow, this looks great. Let's cut into this and try it out. You definitely want to eat this while it's warm if you've got the suet in it, because that kind of solidifies if it's cold. The cabbage is great. It's cooked and it's nice and tender. The spices, even the nutmeg, is something you ought to try in a recipe like this. Very interesting, and that vinegar really helps bring the flavor out. This is a great recipe. You need to try it. Hi, I'm John Townsend, and this is the first episode of many that we will be producing on food preservation techniques. We'll be posting these on and off for the next couple of months. Today's recipe is called To Keep French Beans All Year, and it's from Susanna Carter's 1796 cookbook, The Frugal Housewife. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. We've had many people ask us to produce videos on 18th century food preservation techniques, and we've done a pemmican series in the past and also a salt pork video. Before we proceed with this video, I really want to give a word of warning on food preservation techniques like these. We know so much more today about food pathogens and improperly preserving foods, and doing it improperly is downright dangerous. So make sure to use caution whenever using these kinds of food preservation techniques. In our research, we found that there are 7 or 8 broad categories of food preservation techniques. There's salting, whether a dry salting or a brine wet salting technique, or there's curing, and also there's pickling, which uses vinegar as an acid. There was also potting, where meat was cooked, shredded, and then covered up with a layer of suet or clarified butter to protect it from the air. There is also drying and preserving with sugar, as well as fermentation and also a very primitive form of refrigeration. The recipe from Susanna Carter that we've chosen today uses just plain salt to preserve green beans. And normally you would think of salt as a meat preservative, but here we're using just plain salt for vegetables. This is a very easy recipe. It calls for a large stoneware jar. You'll want to either use a stoneware jar or a glass jar. Redware is probably too porous for this application. For this kind of preservation technique, you really need a crock or a jar. And the jars that we have in our catalog, we've got a 1 quart and a 2 quart jar. These stoneware jars are made right here in Indiana, and they are perfect for this kind of job. This is an extraordinarily simple recipe. All we really need to do is layer salt and green beans into this crock. You need to start off with a nice little layer of salt down in the bottom, and then 1 layer of green beans, and then more salt. And then just keep repeating this until you've got your crock filled. So this technique really is based on the idea that that bacteria just cannot grow in this very high salt environment. And there it is, we filled up this crock, and I'm going to completely cover the top with salt. When you're done, put the lid on the jar and secure it by tying on a piece of cloth. Now for the next few weeks, the salt will draw the liquid out of your beans and the level will go down to about half of what you started with, and that's okay. When it's time to use your beans, they'll need to have the salt removed from them. They're really kind of slushy in here. Let's get them out. We didn't add any liquid. This is all just liquids from that's been extracted from the beans by the salt. And you can see these are just totally coated with salt, and we want to try to remove as much of that as possible before we get them in their final soaking bath. So I'm just going to kind of shake off the salt, and I've got a middle bath here to take off the exterior salt, the stuff that's just clinging to it. And then we'll put them in this little bath to do the final soaking. Desalting these is very similar to salt beef or salt pork. These will get soaked for 24 hours and in this bath, and you'll probably want to change the bath once or twice. And when you use these beans in a dish, you will not need to add salt to it. Even after 24 hours, they're still going to have some salt left over in them. They're best used in something like a soup, and not in, say, a green bean ragu, which would probably make them a little too salty. We salted this batch 3 weeks ago. Let's see what these beans are like. This one hasn't been soaked for very long. Very much like a fresh green bean with a whole lot of salt in it. Still, this will be really good once the salt has been drained out. And a great way to have green beans in the middle of winter when we don't have access to fresh green beans. In our last episode of 18th Century Cooking, we did a carrot pudding. It was a bit more like a bread pudding. Today we're doing a second bread pudding out of Amelia Simmons's cookbook, but this one's more like, say, a carrot custard. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So let's look at this Amelia Simmons recipe. It's very short and simple, and she leaves some stuff out, but here it goes. Carrot pudding. A cup full of boiled and strained carrots, 5 eggs, 2 ounces of sugar and butter each, cinnamon and rose water to your taste. Bake in a deep dish without a paste. Very, very simple. So let's get started. We need about a cup of boiled and mashed carrots. The next thing we need are 5 eggs. I whisked these up nicely. Now we need butter. We need 2 ounces of butter and 2 ounces of sugar. To this we're going to add cinnamon, let's say a teaspoon of cinnamon, just cinnamon to taste, we'll say. The recipe calls for rose water. I really don't care for the kind of aroma that rose water gives off in the recipes. It's very common in 18th century recipes, but I haven't yet acquired the taste yet, so I'm going to leave the rose water out. She recommends baking this in a deep dish. The amount that this makes is just perfect for our little tin bowl. Make sure you pre-butter it before you pour this mixture in. She didn't give a baking time for this. I baked mine for about an hour. It might take even a little bit more, but so you're just gonna have to watch it. Go ahead and bake it at 350 degrees. So this pudding's definitely very different than the last one. I can't wait to find out just how different it tastes. And it's definitely a good bit eggier instead of bready. The sweetness is definitely there. The cinnamon is nice. This is really, really good stuff. And the carrot adds a good bit of flavor, but it doesn't have any kind of, nasty carrotiness. When I was a kid, I really didn't care for carrots very much, but this is really, really good. Today we're going back in history and we're pulling out a recipe for whipped syllabub. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So I'm joined today by Michael Dragoo. He's been helping us out with a few episodes here lately. Michael, have you ever done a syllabub?
I haven't. I don't even know what a syllabub is.
Syllabubs are a drink from the 17th and 18th century. They were constantly evolving and changing, especially by the time we get to the late 18th century, where it goes from a drink, usually alcoholic with a kind of a foamy topping to it, to something that gets a lot more like a trifle or a dessert.
Oh, okay.
So it gets more solid in the 18th century with some other additions. And there are many different ways to do syllabubs. So the recipe we're doing today is from Eliza Smith's The Complete Housewife, 1739. It's called a whipped syllabub.
I can't wait.
We've got a selection of drinks here that we could use as the base for our syllabub. The recipe calls for using either a Rhenish white wine or a claret, but you can also use other things. I've got a sack here or a standard white wine. If you want to make a non-alcoholic version, you can use a white grape juice or an apple juice. And some of the recipes for other syllabubs even included something like cider. When you got those filled, you can put in about a teaspoon of sugar in each one of those cups. You'll want to stir this until the sugar dissolves completely. With the sweet wine, you may not need to add any sugar at all. So while you're working on that, I'm going to make the foamy topping here. Okay. Let's start off with a Rhenish white wine here. There's about a cup of white wine. I've got the juice of 2 lemons. And a half a cup of granulated sugar. Okay, now that our sugar is good and dissolved, we're going to put in, I've got 2 cups or a pint of heavy cream. Let's get that in there. There we are. And now we're just going to whip this up into a froth. A mixer with a whisk attachment, that would really make this short work. So not only is this whipping air into it, but there's a little bit of curdling action that's going on. This can take quite a while if you're doing it by hand. But now that it's thick enough, you can spoon some of this on. There you are. Yeah, you can squirt a little lemon rind on top. The syllabubs were a layered drink, and they may even have other kinds of layers going on here. So later on in the 18th century, when this became more of a dessert and sort of altered, they would put egg whites in here so that made this even stiffer. They might call it an everlasting syllabub.
Got it.
And just for a little garnish and a little extra flavor, let's sprinkle a little nutmeg on top. Let's try them out. Which one do you want to try? I've got one of these.
I'm going to go with the sack, I think.
Okay, go ahead and try that. Well, the whipped cream's got its own unique, yummy flavor. Look at that. So you can tilt it, and it doesn't. The liquid doesn't change. So you can kind of stir this up, and you get a jumble syllabub. So I'm going to stir mine a little bit, trying to bring that wine up, and then. Those are very good. How's the apple juice one?
I like the apple juice. Very much. This is very good.
Even though the topping on this one had wine in it, if you're doing a non-alcoholic version, you can just use the apple juice in that instead of the wine for the topping part.
Yes.
And yeah, it's very, very good. Very good. You're going to like this, and it's a very interesting looking drink.
Yep.
With a lot of history behind it. I want to thank everyone for watching today, and thank you for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. In today's episode, we're making an 18th century pasta, which Hannah Glass calls vermicelli. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. Pasta was not a common dish in 18th century England or in America, but it was introduced into the market in the late 17th century, and it shows up in cookbooks as one thing, as vermicelli. Hannah Glass, in her 1770 cookbook, references vermicelli maybe a half a dozen times. The most interesting recipe is the one in the very back, where she says how to make vermicelli. She apparently wasn't very happy with the imported version, so she gives a recipe for a very simple egg noodle, and that's what we're going to be making today. We're going to start off with a fairly small batch here. Hannah Glass's recipe is simplicity indeed. It is nothing but, it says simply, mix egg yolks with some flour. Started off with about a cup of flour, and to that added 6 well-beaten egg yolks. Let's work this out a little bit. So there's our very simple dough. Just work it up into a stiff paste. Now the recipe calls for rolling this out as thin as possible. Hannah Glass calls for this to be dried in the sun, and then she says to cut it into our as thin as possible little strips. Well, I didn't have much luck with letting this dry and then cutting it. Possibly letting it get to a leather hard state and then cutting it might work, but it works just fine to cut it while it's still damp like this. This is very stiff, so it's fairly easy to cut. So she calls to have this cut as thin as possible. I've got these cut up. Let's put them out on a sheet to dry. We do have these new baking sheets at James Townsend and Son. These are standard tin and formed up in shape like baking sheets were pictured in Diderot's encyclopedia. So if you're looking for a nice small baking sheet in 18th century design, we've got these available now. So let's just sprinkle these out on the sheets, separate them so that they can dry up. And I just cut these into a short, easy to store design, fairly short, like vermicelli is sold today. Hannah Glass says if you want to speed up the process and use these right away, you can slowly dry these in the oven or set them by the fire, as she says, and they'll dry in 15 or 20 minutes. Mine took a good bit longer. I just set mine in my modern oven with it off, and the pilot light was enough to dry these out overnight. I know I'm going to get a question about a gluten-free version of this, and of course you can try this out with something like oat flour or maybe rice flour if you want to make your own sort of 18th century vermicelli without using wheat. So in the next couple of episodes, we're going to be using these vermicelli noodles in several different recipes. Thanks for watching today. In today's episode, we're making Hannah Glass's very simple yet wonderful vermicelli soup. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. vermicelli was not used in a diverse set of dishes in English 18th century cooking. Really, it was kind of relegated to a couple of very specialty groups. The vast majority of recipes that use vermicelli are recipes just like this one that are a very thin kind of a soup with the vermicelli noodles as sort of a thickening kind of a base to give it a little bit of differentiation. I'm going to go ahead and read this recipe because it's just so simple. It says, take 3 quarts of broth and 1 of gravy, mixed together. 1/4 pound of vermicelli blanched in 2 quarts of water and put into the soup. Boil it up for 10 minutes. Season it with salt if it wants any, and put it in your tureen with a crust of French roll baked. We can be tricked by some of these ingredients. The broth is simple enough, but it says it calls for gravy, 1 of gravy. Now, gravy in the 18th century, at least in 18th century English cooking, tended to be the juice that was extracted out of cooked meat. So they would actually roast meat, then they would slash it and press the juices out of it to get a really, really thick kind of a broth. In this recipe, instead of using the gravy she calls for, I'm going to use a bone broth. Let's go ahead and put this together. I'm going to cut this recipe down by into 1/3 because it makes quite a bit. I've got a quart of beef broth. I've already warmed it up here. I've got about half that amount of some nice thick bone broth that I'm going to add to that. And she calls for vermicelli. I've got, say, 1.5 ounces or 2 ounces of that, and she calls for it to be blanched. So this is put into some boiling water, and then I've strained that back out. Now it's time to put this on to boil. Once it gets boiling, it should take about 10 minutes. Our soup's ready. Let's dish it out. As with most of these soup recipes, she does call for a bread in the bowl, or a sops kind of a bread that goes in there. Let's go ahead and give this a try, see if it really needs any seasoning. You know, that bone broth really brought in enough saltiness all by itself. Might need a touch, maybe even a little bit of pepper. I put pepper on everything. But no, it's an excellent, very, very simple soup, right out of the 18th century cookbooks. If you get a chance, it's a perfect cold weather dish, perfect for a day like today. Today we're making a fine hasty pudding. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So today I'm joined by Michael Dragoo. Michael, do you remember the vermicelli episode I did? So a viewer asked, did they use the vermicelli without drying it? And I said originally no, that they didn't. But then I ran into this recipe just the other day. And I said, hey, that looks exactly like pasta, but that isn't dried yet. So we're making this one today. This one starts out very simple. It says to break an egg into as much flour as will make a stiff paste. So this is just 1 egg into some flour. I'll let you go ahead and it says mix it up into a stiff paste, and then we're going to slice it. But first, let's just mix that up. Yep. This recipe is from Hannah Glass's The Art of Cookery. It's probably from the 1747 edition. It also shows up in Eliza Smith's cookbook that's even earlier. So this is a good mid 18th century recipe. Okay, so now that we've got our stiff paste, we can roll this out. Go ahead and set that there. And roll that out nice and thin. Now, the recipe says that we want to roll it out and then slice it as small as you would slice herbs. And then she says to chop it again as small as you could sift in a sifter. So she wants very fine bits of this pasta. Okay. That looks good, Michael. That's
Alrighty.
chopped up nice and fine. Go ahead and transfer it into the bowl.
You know what it looks like? It looks like couscous.
Yes, very similar. And I've got this, this has already been scalded, preheated. We can go ahead and add, let's see, I've got some sugar here, maybe 1/3 of a cup. Let's put in a little bit of cinnamon, which the recipe calls for. Go ahead, a nice healthy pinch of salt.
Okay.
And I've got butter here. It says
size
butter.
A walnut.
The
yeah.
butter the size of a walnut.
Yeah.
Go ahead and add in our pasta, and then
Alright.
I'll take this over the fire.
All right.
So as you can see, she said, cook it until it gets as thick as you
Yep,
like. So it's a
porridgey.
nice little
Tapioca
thickness. It took a little bit of time, but make sure to stir this all the time that you're cooking it. You don't want it to burn.
Okay. Here we go.
Good. There we go. And there's that.
Yay.
Now she says to put a little butter up on top. And I'm going to go ahead and garnish with an extra little bit of cinnamon, just for a pretty look. Go ahead and give it a try, Michael.
Alrighty.
Give that a try.
I'm gonna try. Oh, it's a tasty hasty pudding. It's like custardy kind of an oatmeal thing.
It's like oatmeal.
Huh.
And
Oh, it's good.
depending on if you let it cool down a little bit more, you get something that's almost like tapioca pudding.
Okay. I don't know that's pasta. I don't know that.
Right.
It doesn't taste like it at all.
You wouldn't recognize it
Nope.
as that. And it's so rich and creamy. Look at that.
Yeah.
It's great.
So we went straight from making it to rolling it out. We didn't let it dry at all.
Nope. And
This is good. I like this.
it's got a wonderful, great consistency. Nice and flavorful. You could add a little bit more sugar if you needed that. But it's good just like this.
Yeah, I'm
If you get a chance to try out this hasty pudding, you will love it. I want to thank you for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. I'm going to try more of this.
Today I'm going to show you how to make candied violets. Thank you for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. My birthday's coming up soon, and Mom said I could have candied violets on my birthday cake. So that's what we're trying to do today. Let's get started. Earlier, I was walking out in the woods and I found a whole bunch of nice fresh violets for this project. So today I'm using wild violets. But in 18th century cookbooks, they candied many other flowers, such as roses, marigolds, rosemary, borage, gillyflowers. We know gillyflowers today as pinks or natural carnations, orange blossoms, and nasturtiums. They were for decoration and for special treats, and some of them thought that they had medicinal properties. After we've picked our flowers, we need to prepare our sugar. This is normal granulated sugar that I'm mashing up a little bit finer. I also have 1 egg white beaten up with a tablespoon of water. Although you can do it without a stem, it's a lot easier to do it with a stem for handle. We'll start by holding the violet over the bowl and gently painting it with our egg white and water. It needs to be kind of nice and thick. You can tell because it's shiny after you've painted it right. Paint the bottom and this little bit right here. This one looks pretty good. Now that we've painted our violet, we need to dip it in some sugar. Let's set this aside to dry. I'll keep repeating this until I'm all done with all my violets. This recipe comes from Martha Washington's Book of Cookery. The recipe calls for letting it dry and then doing another layer, but I found that it's sufficient to only do it once. This is a simple 17th century technique, but But there are many different ways to candy flowers. Another way was to preserve them whole in a heavy syrup, or conserve them by pounding them with the sugar. Now we need to cut the stems off. Don't cut off the part that holds the flower petals together, but cut off as close as you can get without cutting the flowers. These will need to dry for about 24 to 48 hours. You need to flip these over about halfway through so both sides get a chance to dry. These will make a beautiful decoration for my birthday cake. Maybe I'll try one. Delicious. It's very interesting. You would think it would be sweet, but it has a little bit of spice in it. This is a fun and easy project. I hope you get a chance to try it out. Thanks for watching. A while ago, my dad showed how to preserve strawberries with only sugar and raisins. Today I'm going to use some of those strawberries to make a strawberry tart. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. If you didn't see the video where my dad showed you how to preserve strawberries, I encourage you to watch it. I find it very interesting that even though he started out with a lot more strawberries than raisins, it doesn't look that way now. The strawberries shrunk and the raisins swelled up. Another interesting observation is the syrup has more strawberry flavor than the strawberries themselves. The raisins, too, taste less like raisins and a little more like strawberries. I'm going to make 2 tarts, one with fresh strawberries and one with preserved strawberries. I'm using a recipe from Mrs. Fraser's 1791 cookbook, The Practice of Cookery. For both tarts, I'll need a 5.5-inch tart tin that's been well buttered. But don't skimp on the butter. If you do, you may never be able to remove your tart from the tart tin. Most modern tart tins have removable bottoms, so it is much easier to get the tart out. My dad sells 2 sizes of tart pans on his website. They're both one-piece pans, just like the ones in the 18th century. Our larger tin is handmade by our tinsmith, Dennis Cooch. I've lined each tart tin with puff paste that I've rolled out fairly thin. For our fresh strawberry tart, I'm using 1 cup of fresh strawberries cut into 1/2-inch pieces, and I'm also using 3/4 cup of sugar. I'm putting the sugar in a saucepan with about a tablespoon of water. For our other tart, we'll use 1.5 cups of our preserved strawberry mix. I want to make sure to get plenty of the syrup too. Now my dad is going to help me with this. For our fresh berry tart, he's going to bring the sugar to a boil. You need to stir this so it doesn't burn. Boil the sugar for a couple minutes, then add your strawberries. Keep it over the heat for a couple minutes more while you stir. For our preserved strawberry tart, my dad will boil the mixture for 3 or 4 minutes. Your strawberries and raisins will plump up as you're boiling them. We'll let it cool down a bit too. Okay, time to fill the tarts. I'm going to put a puff paste on each one of these. Many 18th century cookbooks say that top crusts are necessary to help remove the tarts from the tin. That makes sense to me. Now the last thing we have to do is brush the top crust with melted butter and sprinkle them with a generous coating of sugar. Before putting these in the oven, put them on a baking sheet because they will bubble over.
Okay, are these ready to go?
Yeah.
375, right?
Yeah, for 30 minutes.
For 30 minutes, okay. You did such a great job.
Thanks, Dad. I wonder how they taste.
I'll bet they taste as fantastic as they look. You really need to let these cool down before you try to remove them from their tart tins. Which one do you want to try first?
How about the fresh tart?
The fresh is good. It's exactly what I would expect.
This is delicious.
Is it? Let me try. Let's try the preserved strawberries now. It really does have a great strawberry flavor and very reminiscent of the fresh strawberry one. Don't you think if you had that preserved strawberry one in the middle of winter, it would make you think of that sort of early summer strawberry flavor?
Oh yeah, that is delicious.
Yeah, I love it.
I was thinking that the preserved one wouldn't be as good, but it was actually just as good.
You know, I think these strawberries, while they work really good in a tart, I bet they would be great in something like a boiled pudding. What else do you think these strawberries would be good in?
I think they'd be fantastic in a white pot.
A white pot. Though that would be great. We had one viewer suggest using the strawberries in a Carolina snowball with rice and then using the sugar syrup over the top when you were done.
Yeah.
It would be great. In today's episode, we're making a very interesting and very good olive fritter. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So again, I'm joined today by Michael Dragoo. He's been helping us with a few recipes here recently, and he helped us back when we did the Scott's eggs. Where's this recipe from?
The Complete Confectioner, Hannah Glass, 1800.
1800, and she calls it an olive fritter. Now, that's a really weird name, and these are actually not a typical fritter at all. Normal fritters are sort of a batter, and you toss it into hot oil, and most of the time they have like apples in them. This is a lot more like a turnover, and I think that's where that term olive comes from. They made a meat product that was called an olive, where they would take something and they would stuff it inside of meat. So maybe it also refers to our modern olive kind of idea, where there's a pimento inside of the olive itself. I'm not sure exactly where she gets that olive term, but this actually instead of using a batter, uses puff paste. And we did puff paste back in like the third season, so make sure to check out that video if you're interested in making your own puff paste. And what goes inside of them is a smashed pistachio paste. That's what she calls for, along with other ingredients, maybe marmalade or something else she suggests. Yep. But let's start making this pistachio paste. In the 18th century kitchen, to make their pistachio paste, they would have taken their raw pistachios and ground them up in their mortar and pestle. We're not going to do that today. We've already pre-pulverized our pistachios. You can do this in your home kitchen with just a simple food processor and get these ground up into a fairly small amount here. And to this, we'll add just 1/4 cup of cream. We're going to make this into our paste.
I think while you're mashing, I'm going to get my puff paste ready. I've gone ahead and cut these into 3-inch squares, and I'm just going to get my egg wash. It's just a tablespoon or 2 of water with an egg yolk. And I'm just going to coat the outside edges of my puff paste with this wash. It's going to act like a little cement. Just going to get the edges done here very quickly. Alrighty.
Okay, that looks good.
About a teaspoon each, huh?
I'll let you fold that up. Well, these are ready now to put into the oil. Let's get started on that. Your oil temperature should be 325 to 350 degrees. We're using lard as they would have done in the 18th century. You can use whatever cooking oil you desire. So those look fantastic.
We are not done yet. We're going to make a glaze. It's simple. It's 2 cups of powdered sugar. We've got the juice from 1 lemon, and we've got an egg white. We're just going to whisk all this together.
This recipe calls for either a white glaze or brown glaze, and many times they did other colors like green or red. They'd make a green glaze with spinach juice, or, yeah, sounds great, doesn't it? Or a red with cochineal. This one's a white glaze, or the brown you would use a caramelized sugar to darken it up. These look great.
Well, look who's here.
Ivy, come on in. Come here, I'll set this chair up for you.
All right.
There you go.
Just in time.
There we go. Now we got someone to try this out on. We haven't tried these yet. Are you ready? Go ahead and give one a try. You haven't gotten down to the filling yet. Try that. Let's try it. You go ahead, Michael. Very good.
Oh, very good. Those are very good.
What do you think, Ivy? And pistachio. I was worried it was going to overpower this,
No.
but it's got a very good mix. Now, she says you can put other fillings in this. Marmalade or other sweet things in this. I would like to try these out with a lot of different fillings. These are great.
They're very good.
What do you think, Ivy?
I could get these all day.
Yeah, I think so too. What do you think? We'll make these again? I think so. These are great. Go ahead and give them a try. Thanks so much for watching today. In today's episode, we're revisiting the Posset. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So I'm joined again today by Michael Drigoo. Michael, did you watch the other Posset episode that I did?
Yes.
Yes, you did. No, so this Posset is very different. It's from exactly the same cookbook.
Okay.
But instead of using a thickening that was the Naples biscuits or breadcrumbs, in this case, it's just with eggs. We're just thickening this with eggs, and it might look a little scary as we're cooking it, but it works out. So you've got 5 eggs that we've whipped up. We need those strained out, so you go ahead and do that. So what we're doing here is we're trying to get the treadles and the little kind of filaments out of our eggs. Now we got the eggs strained. Go ahead and mix in. We've got some wine here. It calls for canary. We're just going to use a sack, which is a sherry, basically, a sweet sherry. This is 1/3 of a pint.
All right.
And we've got some sugar here, about 1/4 cup. Stir that in.
Okay.
So that I want you to heat over a very low heat. I don't want it to boil, so bring that up just to scalding hot. So I've got about 10 ounces of milk here, and to this we're going to just sprinkle in a little bit of nutmeg. We don't have to go crazy with that. And heat this over a low heat, just like the eggs. And keeping stirring it. We don't want it to burn. We want it to bring it just up to boiling. The key is to keep stirring this so that it doesn't burn. The recipe calls for pouring this at a great height into our, while it's being stirred the whole time. Stir, stir. Okay. The recipe calls for taking this off of the fire, but setting it by the fire. It's just to keep it warm, and its consistency is going to change as it does that. We're going to just set this by the fire. Okay. So this has been by the fire, and it's set up. It's not stiff, but it's definitely thickened.
Yep.
And possets were generally a hot drink or a hot dish. We will call this one sort of a halfway in between.
Here you go.
Now, this still looks pretty hot. So let's give it a try. It's kind of wiggly. Wow. Is that great?
Once again, unexpectedly.
Yeah. The sack does not take over the flavor.
Nope.
It just gives you a nice hint of that sack flavor.
Well, it's smooth. It's not custardy. It's not scrambled eggy.
No.
It's sweet. It's, I don't even taste egg per se. It's just, that was the thickening agent.
No, there's not a real eggy flavor to it.
It was simple.
Many times possets like this were a sick or an invalid thing. So it's a
Like
rich
chicken soup of the time.
Exactly, exactly like that.
And I will try this with my reenacting because it's simple and it's.
This one's a little bit more
bulletproof.
difficult since you're cooking two things at once, and then you have to stir them together. But it makes a great dish. This one's so easy. Give this one a try if you get a chance. It's really not something we have a similar thing in today's diet. So if you get a chance, try out this wonderful posset. I want to thank you for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Last week I showed you how to make a strong broth, or as we might know it, a bone broth. Today we're going to take that broth and make an asparagus soup that is so delicious. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. This asparagus soup recipe is from Elizabeth Cleland's A New and Easy Method of Cookery from 1755. Let's get started. The recipe calls for greening up your beef broth with the juice of spinach. And in the 18th century, you would take your spinach here and we would smash it around until we crush it into a paste. But that's an awful lot of work. In a modern kitchen, if you've got a juicer, it's child's play. If you don't have a juicer, then you can add a little bit of water to your spinach and use your blender and whir it up into a thick slurry here. And now we can just take and strain that slurry off. You can pour your puree into your jelly bag. Spinach juice like this is used in many different 18th century recipes to color things green. Let's just add that to our broth. Let's put this onto a quick boil. After this is boiling, we add asparagus chopped up in half-inch segments. I've got an onion that's got some cloves stuck in it. We've got some mace, some black pepper, and a little bit of allspice, along with some sweet herbs. And finally, just a little bit of salt to taste. This is a great spring dish, and you could substitute your asparagus with some other things. You could put cabbage in this, like a spring lettuce, or even stinging nettles would be great in this. Just before you serve this up, make sure to remove the onion and the sweet herbs. Once this is boiling, it's time to thicken it, and we're going to thicken it with a simple roux. Roux were very common in the 18th century for thickening. They weren't technically called roux. This one's very simple. It's made with a stick of butter and a half a cup of flour, and I made this ahead of time last night, and I let it cool so it would be easy to use today. The recipe says it needs to boil a little while after you've added your roux. It's so rich and creamy and it smells great. Let's give it a try. That's excellent. The asparagus has a great, wonderful flavor. Hasn't been boiled too long, so it's still got a little bit of tooth to it. It's got a fantastic flavor. This is a great spring soup. You really must try this. I want to thank you for joining us today as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. In today's episode, we're revisiting the posset. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking with James Townsend and Son. So I'm joined again today by Michael Drigoo. Michael, did you watch the other posset episode that I did?
Yes.
Yes, you did. No, so this posset is very different. It's from exactly the same cookbook.
Okay.
But instead of using a thickening that was the Naples biscuits or breadcrumbs, in this case, it's just with eggs. We're just thickening with this with eggs, and it might look a little scary as we're cooking it, but it works out. So you've got 5 eggs that we've whipped up. We need those strained out, so you go ahead and do that. So what we're doing here is we're trying to get the treadles and the little kind of filaments out of our eggs. Now we got the eggs strained. Go ahead and mix in. We've got some wine here. It calls for canary. We're just going to use a sack, which is a sherry, basically, a sweet sherry. This is 1/3 of a pint.
All right.
And we've got some sugar here, about 1/4 cup. Stir that in.
Okay.
So that I want you to heat over a very low heat. I don't want it to boil, so bring that up just to scalding hot. So I've got about 10 ounces of milk here, and to this we're going to just sprinkle in a little bit of nutmeg. We don't have to go crazy with that. And heat this over a low heat, just like the eggs. And stirring it. We don't want it to burn. We want it to bring it just up to boiling. The key is to keep stirring this so that it doesn't burn. The recipe calls for pouring this at a great height into our, while it's being stirred the whole time. Stir, stir. Okay. The recipe calls for taking this off of the fire, but setting it by the fire. It's just to keep it warm, and its consistency is going to change as it does that. We're going to just set this by the fire. Okay. So this has been by the fire, and it's set up. It's not stiff, but it's definitely thickened.
Yep.
And possets were generally a hot drink or a hot dish. We will call this one sort of a halfway in between.
Here you go.
Now it still looks pretty hot, so let's give it a try. It's kind of wiggly. Wow, is that great?
Once again, unexpectedly.
Yeah. The sack does not take over the flavor.
Nope.
It just gives you a nice hint of that sack flavor.
Well, it's smooth. It's not custardy. It's not scrambled eggy.
No.
It's sweet. It's, I don't even taste egg per se. It's just,
No.
That was the thickening agent.
No, there's not a real eggy flavor to it.
It was simple.
Many times possets like this were a sick or an invalid thing. So it's a
Like
rich
chicken soup of the time.
Exactly, exactly like that.
And I will try this with my reenacting because
Right.
It's simple and it's pretty
This
much
one's a little bit more
bulletproof.
difficult since you're cooking two things at once, and then
Yeah.
you have to stir them together. But it makes a great dish. This one's so easy. Give this one a try if you get a chance. It's really not something we have a similar thing
No.
in today's
Nope.
diet. So if you get a chance, try out this wonderful posset. I want to thank you for joining us as we savor the flavors and the aromas of the 18th century. Hi, I'm John Townsend, and today we're going to be making a very interesting 18th century herbal tea. Thanks for joining us today on 18th Century Cooking. Very recently, John Britton, as well as a few other people, asked about herbal teas in the 18th century, and I wasn't quite sure about that, but very recently I was reading through this little cookbook. This is England's newest way in all sorts of cookery and pastry by Henry Howard. It's a 1750 or 1726 cookbook, and it's got an interesting little section inserted into it, and it's a good advice to English people by the late eminent physician. And in this little 2-page article, he describes an herbal tea. This is a very simple recipe. Let's get started. This physician's recipe calls for 20 or 30 leaves of sage. We also have half that amount of rosemary and 15 or 20 stems or grains of good English saffron. Now we're gonna pour hot water, boiling water over the top of this and stopper our container up nice and close and let that steep for 15 or 20 minutes. It's been 20 minutes, so now let's strain this infusion out. There we are. It smells wonderful. Now we can put this into a server to serve this out. This coffee server is a very interesting piece that Dennis Cooch makes for us. It's a coffee server from the 18th century. Very interesting design for the spout and very difficult to make. This particular type of tinware is specifically made for serving and is not intended for brewing. It's a very nice and subtle herbal tea. It's got a very beautiful aroma with the rosemary and the sage both there together. Make sure to use fresh if you have it available because it makes it so much better. So the physician who suggests this recipe, he says, it helps you resist poison and infection, pestilential air and noisome stinks. It strengthens the brain, the heart, and the nerves and comforts all your vital spirits. And it breeds good blood and expels all the humors which offend the stomach and the body.